Hi, this is Pat Johnson, your psychology instructor, and in this mini lecture we're going to talk about retrieval. In other words, getting information out of long-term memory. We're going to be talking about recognition versus recall tasks. We'll talk about retrieval cues, and finally we'll finish up with talking about the serial position effect. There are different ways that we can measure memory. One is with recall tasks. And teachers do this often. They ask students to recall information, and that would be an example of a test question like an essay or fill in the blank. So when you recall information, you have to pull it from long-term memory, and this can be difficult. Here's an example of a retrieval question. Name the 7 dwarfs from the Snow White movie. Now, you have to come up with that information yourself. Obviously, I wouldn't want you to use Google or anything like that. But see how many dwarfs you can come up with. Some people can only come up with 1 or 2. Some never saw the movie. Some can come up with all 7. Usually students can come up with 3 or 4 dwarfs. So pause the video and see how many dwarfs you can name. Okay, how many dwarfs did you get? Now let's see if you do better with a recognition task instead of a recall task. In a recognition task, you don't have to recall the information, you merely have to recognize whether information is correct or not. So memory is demonstrated by identifying terms previously learned. And this is an example of a multiple choice test where you have questions where all you have to do is identify the correct answer. So this would be an example of a recognition task. Again, which names were the 7 dwarfs? Can you name the 7 dwarfs? And here I give you some different options. So from these different names, see if you can come up with the names of the 7 dwarfs. Pause the video, mark down the ones that you thought were dwarfs, and then count them up. Here's the actual names of the 7 dwarfs: Happy, Sleepy, Dopey, Doc, Bashful, Grumpy, and Sneezy. And ask yourself, did I do better at recognition or did I do better at recall? And usually people do a lot better on recognition tasks, not recall tasks. Recognition tasks are a lot easier. We just have to recognize the information. Here's another example. I often have tests being a mixture of multiple choice and essay. If the test was all recognition, though, it would be all multiple choice or true false or matching or something like that. If it was a recall test totally, it would be an all essay or all fill in the blank test where choices were not given for the different blanks. And most of you would cringe when you would learn about having a totally recall test where you couldn't use any information and you had to recall all of it. The next topic I want to discuss is retrieval cues. Retrieval cue is any stimuli linked to a specific memory. So it could be the actual event, it could be a feeling, it could be a place, it could even be a smell. But retrieval cues usually occur in an instance where when you are trying to retrieve, in other words, remember something, you go back in your mind to that place where you learned the information. So here's an example. Let's suppose you took a class with me as your teacher in one classroom. I want you to ask yourself, would you do better, the same, or worse if you took the test on the information you learned in a different classroom? Now, it's very typical that students would do not as well. They would do more poorly if they took the test in a different classroom. And here's why. When you are taking a test in the same classroom that you learned that information, you're using all sorts of retrieval cues. I often have students look up at a blank whiteboard, and when I asked them later why they were doing that, they said they were imagining in their mind all the stuff I had written on the board. I've also seen students look up at the blank TV screen where I've shown videos. They may wear the same clothing or use their quote-unquote lucky pencil, but all of these are retrieval cues, cues that help them retrieve the memory of learning that information. The last topic I want to talk about is the serial position effect. Now, serial means in a series. So the serial position effects is basically the position in a series really has a great effect on what you remember. So the serial position effect is our tendency to recall best, the first and last items in a series. And here's a graph showing the percent of recall and the position in a series. Let me give you a concrete example. Years ago, when I first came to this college, I was interviewing for a position where lots of people had applied for the job and had gotten interviews. There were so many people that they were doing interviews every 45 minutes, starting at 8 a.m. and going to 4:30 p.m. And when they called me and said I had an interview, I said, well, I really need to have either the first or the last interview of the day because I'm teaching part-time at in another city, and I can only come up either first thing in the morning or last thing in the afternoon. So I need the first or the last. So let's suppose that these are all the interview slots. I got the last slot of the day, the slot right before they made the decision. Now you obviously have to be good in an interview because you could also be memorable in a bad way. But these are the two positions, this a little less, this a little less, but these first and last positions are the ones most memorable. And we can see that in this graph that the probability of recall is not that good for those positions that are in the middle. So you can use this to your advantage. It's not just a concept in psychology of memory. It's also a concept that has very practical purposes.